Hey internets, this is going to be a video about the Epstein Files, specifically a video dedicating to refuting some of the latest nonsense and bad takes about it you may have heard recently, as the Justice Department recently released a searchable massive email dump to the Epstein case, which has resulted in the internet just kind of losing their minds for the last few weeks. Because unfortunately, in a high-profile case like this, there is unfortunately a very high incentive for people to just kind of lie about things. And then for other people to just kind of spread the lies that align with their ideology and preconceived notions without really trying to understand anything or checking where those facts come from. And of course, spoiler alert, the mainstream media has once again proven that they are definitely not immune to this. And so this general conversation surrounding the Epstein Files has been kind of muddied by a lot of garbage. And thus it is time to take some of that trash out, so to speak. But first I'll just start things out with a quick rundown before getting into the debunkings. In case you haven't been keeping up with politics, Jeffrey Epstein is a case that is the epitome of our financial and political elite class doing some extremely perverted, horrible things, and then using their elite status to get away with those horrible things. Jeffrey Epstein can be best explained as an elite financier with massive ties to global elites. And he, alongside Maxwell, are accused of running a large-scale sex trafficking operation that was mainly targeting vulnerable underage girls, and basically pimping them out to other global elites. And he kind of took advantage of a lot of the usual problems that a lot of teenage girls have. For example, offering them the promise of some kind of major high-paying modeling gig, taking advantage of many young girls' desire to just get their name out in the world, only to then just sexually exploit them and then throw them out on the streets. Or at least that's what these allegations against him seem to suggest. And then when he got caught and as he was awaiting jail, he just kind of mysteriously died, all the while likely knowing the names of many of said global elites that he was pimping said underage girls to, just before Epstein was about to spill the beans on them in court. Gee, how convenient for them. Nothing suspicious about that at all. And so this of course incited a lot of public outrage, along with the conspiracy theory voted most likely to be conspiracy fact of the year 2019, Epstein didn't kill himself. But really the whole thing is just the epitome of a tale as old as time. Unfortunately, a lot of times the people who manage to claw their way into power in society aren't exactly the best individuals in terms of character. And so the tale of the high-class corrupt old pervert using his status and connections to abuse girls who are too young to know any better, well, unfortunately, the Jeffrey Epstein case is really just the latest installment. It's pretty safe to say that this has happened many, many times in human history, and a lot of people, myself included, are just kind of tired of it. But unfortunately, this state of being tired of it also tends to lead people to kind of lose their minds over it. And that's likely one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of misinformation and sometimes just outright disinformation being spread around on this. So let's get started with the first bad take, which is people thinking that it's a nothing burger now. And there's many reasons why a lot of people are thinking it's a nothing burger. Some of it is just the general chud law of nothing ever happens, but a lot of it is people just kind of jaded because of how often this tends to happen in human history, and thus to some degree it's just history repeating itself, and thus it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because the root cause of it is just the human condition, and you can't perfect the human condition, and therefore the Epstein case is just the latest example of this thing that is going to happen, as terrible as it is, and it's just going to happen again and again and again, and you're not really going to help it because human beings are flawed. And you can definitely understand where that mentality is coming from, but the thing is, if you look at history, it's also a bit too pessimistic. Because yes, this has happened before, but the thing is, as time goes on, we as humanity have come up with better ways of dealing with it. There's a cognitive bias known as declinism. I'd like to think that we actually can come up with at least a better way of stopping this kind of behavior amongst corrupt elites. But another reason some people are saying it's a nothing burger kinda may just come from information overload. So going back to why this has kind of recently exploded again in recent internet discussion, which is the Justice Department in the last month making a lot more emails available in their searchable database of Jeffrey Epstein emails. And so if you've been keeping up with news on social media and on the internet, you've probably seen a bunch of new email leaks and images like this one being posted around. It's because there's a whole bunch of new ones available. A lot of emails available, actually. 3 million new ones, to be specific. Apparently, as of January 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice published an additional 3 million of those pages as a result of that Epstein Files Transparency Act that Trump signed a while ago, bringing the amount of documents to about 3.5 million total. So yeah, for those of you wondering why the discussion around Epstein just suddenly seems to have re-exploded again, this right here is why. And while it's a good thing that there at least releasing something, the fact that they're releasing so many documents also brings with it the kind of obvious problem that a lot of these documents are just going to be boring and mundane. And so it kind of has the same problem I recall from the Hillary Clinton email dump on WikiLeaks. There's definitely some wrongdoings happening in those emails, but you have to dig through a lot of really dumb emails to find them. A lot of just boring, mundane finance stuff, or notes about what's for dinner, or just random discussions on where someone's going to be on Saturday night, or just general clerical documents that, while kind of important, are also painfully uninteresting. And so what this means is that if you go into the Epstein library and search for some random object, let's search for the word bottles here. Oh look, I get 4,509 results. And most of it is just completely boring, mundane stuff that nobody would really care about. The first 3 results being one, just a request for specific wine bottles. The next one down I got was just about the private jet and bottles of emergency oxygen supply. And then the third one down was just another generic email of someone sending out generic requests for a bunch of specific bottles of wine. Like I said, stuff that most people wouldn't really care about. That's because these millions of emails and documents are not really curated in any kind of meaningful way. It's just all of the documents from people that the Justice Department deemed as loosely associated with Jeffrey Epstein enough to include them in this massive dump. And so a lot of it really is just crap. But that of course doesn't mean that there's nothing there. The problem here seems to be people had unrealistic expectations for these leaks. The obvious point of contention being that a lot of names are redacted that probably shouldn't be redacted. And this makes a lot of the conversations hard to follow. Is this actually coming from someone close to Epstein? Is it coming from a specific elite? Or is this just some random email he received from some random person spewing nonsense? And it's also an issue because you can't really see who's doing anything wrong when these leaks show a few yikesy things that do show that something definitely was wrong. Like, for example, let's search for something a bit more specific, like gynecologist, or women's fertility health. Going through the documents with a bit more of a specific term in mind, we start to see a few more yikesy things. Like this one, hey Bella, is there a gynecologist that we normally use for the girls? I need to make blank an appointment. Yeah, nothing suspicious about that one there. Why would you need a gynecologist that you normally use for the girls? And then of course, why is that name blank? The narrative from the state seems to be that they're protecting victims, but I don't know about you, but it kinda looks like they're more or less protecting the perpetrators here. I mean, sure, a victim's name seems to be redacted as well, but why also redact the from field? And then of course there's this one that made the rounds, with a little bit of a misspelling in the gynecologist. Do you remember the name of the gynecologist that you used to send your victims to? Jeffrey Epstein replies, New York? Yes, many years ago you used to send them to a gyno in New York who once commented something to the effect that you were keeping him in business single-handedly. Yeah, so let's just combine this with the previous email and we can see what's being said here. This is clearly a something burger. It's just that because names are redacted, it's hard to follow things. And that's the state's fault. But another thing you really have to consider is that elites aren't stupid. They can definitely be evil, but they're rarely that stupid. They're often midwits, but they're rarely outright completely dumb. Seriously expecting them to email each other with outright obvious admissions to abusing underage minors and other such crimes is ridiculous. Even people who aren't that computer savvy know that the government can pretty easily read just about any kind of electronic communication. It's been pretty common knowledge for over 50 years. And so what happens instead, and this is another thing that people have kind of pointed out, is that they may actually be talking in code. There may be a bigger burger here than what appears on the surface. And one big one that some people pointed out is the term beef jerky. Going through these emails, some have come to suspect that Epstein and co. have been using the phrase beef jerky, or just general jerky, as a code word to really just mean one of the girls that they're trafficking. And this take I would have to rank as plausible. If you look up beef jerky, the discussions that they tend to have about it seem to be a little weird. Obsessive email change where Jeffrey Epstein just has to get his beef jerky for the next flight. And they all treat it like it's the most important thing in the world. And there seems to be two possible narratives floating around here that people suspect this means. One is, again, people suspect it's just a code word for the girls being trafficked. And so by asking for some jerky for his flight all the time, Epstein's really just asking for some flight entertainment, which is a little disgusting. But there's also people suspecting that it actually means children meat, as in they're literally eating kids. and they're using jerky as a code word for that. I kinda have my doubts on that one. If anything, the first one seems a little bit more plausible. The problem is you have to remember just kind of the law of large numbers. There's millions of emails here. For instance, if you just search for some other random food, like let's just say mangoes, you get a little over 200 results for mango, and messages from people saying things like they're munching on yogurt and mango. Really yummy mango. You have to remember that the Justice Department is including just about everyone even loosely related to Epstein, and so not everything has to be coded language. A lot of it really is them just eating totally normal food. But then you have this email to Epstein saying he's working at a restaurant called Cannibal and Cooks, wait for it, beef jerky and steak. Yeah, so it's all a little weird, it's a little suspicious there. TLDR, there's definitely something going on, there's definitely some dark stuff, and there's definitely at the very least enough to say that Jeffrey Epstein is most likely guilty of the crimes that he is alleged to be guilty of, and there's definitely some decadent elites out there who are guilty of purchasing his services, would be the nicest way to put it. Whether it's just allegations as alleged, or something far, far darker than that, I guess we'll just have to wait for time and more evidence to tell. And that's really the biggest problem here. A lot of these reaching ideas and conspiracies about the Epstein Files, a lot of them, the real problem is just coming down from the fact that the names of the conspirators are being redacted when they shouldn't be. And so one correct thing that's going around is just mass outrage at the fact that the Department of Justice has failed to seriously and really release the Epstein Files in a meaningful way. I mean, sure, having a massive amount of data like this is better than nothing. It's just when they block out the most useful bits of information, well, that's obviously very ridiculous, and you can't be surprised when people look at that and they start assuming the worst. So in the end, the only narrative that it's a nothing burger that makes sense is just blaming the Justice Department and the Trump admin for failing to really release the files as promised. There's definitely enough here, though, from what we're looking at to say that bad things were happening. At the very least, it's most likely that the crimes as alleged, simply pimping out underage girls to elites, is probably what was going on. You can say that at the very least. And yes, something far darker could have been going on, but really knowing that for sure will require actual unredacted leaks where we can see the actual photos and use the actual names to make serious connections. But anyways, let's move on to one of the more obviously false narratives, one of the sillier narratives actually, which is this idea that 4chan and the entire online right somehow exists now as they are only because Epstein funded a PSYOP to ensure their existence, and that all Chuddite opinions are thus Epstein opinions in an allegedly brilliant Mossad 400-dimensional chess plot to make young males dislike Mossad. And while that sounds absurd on its face, surprisingly, a lot of people seriously seem to believe this one. I'm seeing it on Twitter, a lot of it on Blue Sky, and of course a whole ton of it on Plebit. And there's definitely a lot of left-leaning influencers and breadoids who have definitely capitalized on this narrative. And it's kind of sad really, because they're somewhat seeding into this new kind of toxic discussion on the internet, where now instead of actually engaging with what the other side is saying, now it's just, oh, you know, Epstein wants you to have that opinion, oh, Epstein wants you to think like that. Hey, that's a nice opinion. Did Epstein give it to you? Yeah, so needless to say, it's leading to some pretty bad faith discussions and just poor quality discourse in general. But to refute it, I'm mainly going to focus on this video from Voosh. So let's look at a few quick clips.
You know, the whole, like, slopulism, the culture war was put in place by the elites to distract you while they rob the world of all of its wealth. You know how that's always been true? It is now truer than it has ever been in all of human history. I cannot believe it. It feels fake, but it's real. Epstein probably had a hand in the release of Pull on 4chan. Moot relaunched Pull on basically the same day he met Jeffrey Epstein for the first time. And wow, it turns out that Bannon was affiliated not only with Epstein, but Epstein was affiliated with Moot when he made the Pull board, and the Pull board was the epicenter of this entire goddamn thing. Asmongold types? Yep. The entire right-wing culture war was manufactured by Epstein as a way of getting Trump elected and also promulgating a pro-right-wing, pro-pedophile culture. Simple as. The entire thing was a deep state op. 11. What if we created a containment board for politics on 4chan and then we seeded it with lots and lots of far-right propaganda so we use it to kickstart stuff like Gamergate, Pizzagate, QAnon, like every single like right-wing movement that is now metastasized and developed into the modern MAGA crowd, all of it a construction of Jeffrey Epstein, or at least influenced by Jeffrey Epstein.
So yeah, there's quite a few problems with this narrative. The first of these, and possibly the most obvious on its face, is just the general issue of psychological projection when it comes to who is pushing the culture war. Neo-Marxists have been invading our media institutions for over 50 years and using their positions they gained to push ideological propaganda. People noticed this and started calling it out, and then those same neo-Marxists blame the noticers for the culture war as if to imply that the act of calling someone out on their schemes is the cause of the scheme. It's just completely nonsensical gaslighting. I already did a Denkfumo video on this, but TLDR, it's effectively just projection and misrepresenting how institutions spread ideas and how culture is a part of that, and thus everybody engaging in any kind of political or philosophical talk is engaging in culture to some degree. So the whole, oh, you're being distracted by the culture war argument, it's a very inherently disingenuous argument. The second problem with this narrative is that it's just obviously false if you're familiar with anonymous image board discussion history or just the history of the internet in general. For example, if you are an old friend like myself from the 80s and 90s elite hacksaw culture and have been spending maybe a bit too much time online since before Zophar's domain even existed, and thus in the before times where Usenet and IRC were much more serious business, then you kind of know that the /poll quote-unquote culture wars are and were just the logical conclusions of the directions of those discussions where internet anonymous discussions were already heading to over a decade before Epstein is alleged to have concocted this whole scheme of allegedly psyoping the current modern online right into existence. For example, before poll there was /news, not the current /news, but an older /news that had pretty much the exact same discussions and ideas as /poll. And even before then, really /poll is more or less just a containment board for discussions that already existed elsewhere on 4chan. Which, I mean, if you were there and you're not just a total tourist new friend, well, then they would already know that. Like, for example, anti-feminism threads used to infest /A. Culture wars threads were already all over /V. Anti-SJW hate was pretty much everywhere on the site. In fact, most of online discussion, since online discussion was a thing, has had pockets of discussion forums where this kind of anti-SJW thinking had already existed. And so thus, it is impossible for Epstein to have created this type of discussion in 2011 through /poll through some kind of mass psyop, because this type of discussion existed long before 2011 and long before /poll. And honestly, it's kind of funny in a way, because I've suspected for a very long time now that a lot of these far left socialist RedTube influencers were in fact nothing but a bunch of tourists who were just complete and total noobs to online political and philosophical discussion. But it's nice to finally have some actual serious hard confirmation of this. And it's a problem I've kind of been noticing a lot as the whole Gamergate thing that's been pointed out in regards to this has been aging over time. The only people who are anti-Gamergate, in addition to them always just being the type of person who always believes whatever mainstream corporate media tells them, they're also just tourists. A big reason why they buy into the false corporate media narrative is because they just simply weren't there. Or at the very least, they weren't paying attention. And so the root of the problem is that they just don't know things unless they're forced to believe narratives from other people. And naturally, they go to the easiest narratives to consume, the narrative where you can just Google it and download your approved opinions from your nearest corpo stadiest media outlet. And also, another really big problem with this narrative is that it's really just kind of reaching really, really far. In fact, looking at the evidence they present for this, even if we didn't know anything at all, it would still, just from this little amount of evidence we're seeing, would still be significantly less likely to be true than the earlier beef jerky equals child meat narrative. They don't actually know or have any information here about what specifically Epstein and Christopher Poole talked about. It's just Boris telling Epstein that he should meet Christopher Poole, and then Epstein goes to meet Christopher Poole, says that they talked for an hour, and that's it. Sure, the coincidence of the dates is a little bit interesting, but again, if you know that /poll is just a rebranded /news, then you know it doesn't matter. And there's also just this kind of general silly thing of a lot of people, especially the Redditors, not really realizing or understanding that people on anonymous image boards have known that they have been under attack by various psyops for years. If you tell anybody who's followed anonymous image board discussions for for over 20 years that, hey, don't you know that those anonymous image boards are prime targets for being spammed, and that the feds are always trying to inject them with honeypots? And that person will tell you, wow, gee, really? I didn't know that. Wow. I mean, this is total news to me. I was completely unaware of all of the psyops on Slashball. And so again, it's just further showing and emphasizing their status as tourists. The only truth to this really just seems to be that it is kind of true that around that time, the online right became a little bit more extreme, you could say. But that can be a lot more closely tied to the date of Gamergate. And that wasn't a psyop, rather it was almost exactly the opposite. It was an attempted psyop where our corporate media went mask off on just how dishonest they are, and people who were paying enough attention and who were not just, again, tourists, well, for many of the younger generation, that was really just their first time seeing just what is behind that mask. It's also important to point out that another thing really wrong about this narrative is that it shows, once again, that a lot of the breadtube socialists, a lot of their big problem with the online right is that they just don't really understand the online right. And so they're always desperately looking for some kind of explanation as to why they exist, because they genuinely don't understand why they exist. And that might be the real reason why they're latching on to this sort of Epstein narrative, even though the evidence is very, very, very low. Like, for instance, Voosh, in his video, if you watch the whole thing, he talks a lot about Epstein and Israel as if that's just a purely right-wing thing. No, it isn't. Out of all factions of the online right, whether it be the libertarian right like myself, or NRX, or alt-light, or alt-right, or going all the way to the Groypers, none of these factions are pro-Zionist from what I've seen. The only factions that are majority pro-Israel happen to be the boomer right or deep establishment GOP, which doesn't really matter because the boomer left establishment Democrats are also pro-Israel. So it's actually more of a young versus old thing on that issue rather than a left versus right thing. And of course, when you're talking about the young right, different factions of the online right hold those beliefs for very radically different reasons. But really, overall, this entire Epstein created the online right narrative just reeks of more you're distracted by the culture war psychological projection, and is wrong for the same reasons that that narrative is wrong. It's been proven through many leaks by now that places with more censorship and cathedral-like control were the places that facilitated the online left woke movement, such as the mass-scale Reddit bannings of entire subreddits for having incorrect opinions, as well as mass Twitter censorship back in the Dorsey days, and mass Facebook censorship, and other just kind of mass big tech censorship, all of which we now know had very heavy ties to DNC elites. Meanwhile, the online right, within the youth at least, in the last 10 years has been constantly retreating to places with less censorship like Kiwi Farms, Alt-Chans, the Win Network, Gab, BitChute, etc., all online spaces notorious for having near zero censorship. So the whole thing can thus be summarized as the man who agrees with the establishment while thinking he is a rebel meme, attempting to project his insanity by now claiming that those who disagree with him must be in league with Epstein for some reason. The fact that they have absolutely zero conclusive evidence for this take, of course, obviously doesn't really matter, because under the hood it really just appears to be a release valve for their cognitive dissonance and lack of self-awareness, resulting in a constant need to accuse others of what they are in fact guilty of. The truth is, it's pretty obvious which ideology was manufactured by elite interests here, and it sure as heck wasn't any faction of the online right. But if you want a fast and easy way to refute this, I would honestly just stick with the fact that Poll was ultimately just created to be a containment board for discussions that were already present, and that it was effectively just a reincarnation of the old /news board. Therefore, anybody who makes this argument is really just admitting to being a tourist. Which, speaking of the mainstream corporate media sticking its nose in every place where it doesn't belong, let's now move on to their narrative. Which, the main problem of the mainstream media narrative is really just this fixation of X person is in the Epstein Files and then sensationalizing it. And in corporate media's case, this fixation seems almost entirely on Donald Trump, which doesn't really surprise me considering how they still kind of don't really like Donald Trump. Me personally, I just don't really care about Trump. I think if he's guilty of any wrongdoing that can be found in the Epstein Files, he should be thrown to the winds with the rest of them. And if he's not, then people need to just kind of get over it and accept the fact that this is just another case of TDS. But I decided to look into it anyway. And what I found is that yes, Trump definitely appears in the Epstein Files. In fact, he appears almost 5,000 times. However, I personally couldn't find anything that had any real meaning to it or implicating any kind of possibility that Trump actually did anything illegal. The problem is, again, you have to realize that these Epstein files are really just any kind of documents and electronic communication by either Epstein himself or people that he's associated with. And so a lot of it is just utterly meaningless stuff like this, like Epstein receiving an email showing him how well Trump is doing in the polls in July 2016. This, of course, proves absolutely nothing. Or another one is just a copy of the Donald Trump Wikipedia article appearing in the Epstein files for some reason. Again, completely and utterly meaningless, tells you absolutely nothing. But most of it really just seems to be Epstein receiving various news article forwards and various summaries about the news in regards to what Trump is doing due to, the fact that Trump ran for president and became president. I looked through about 100 of these and pretty much all of them look something like this. Just a forward of the news and Trump is mentioned. And so, of course, for the purpose of good faith, I also looked to see what leftists who dislike Trump very, very much, of course, had to say. And they haven't really been able to find any incriminating evidence either. Granted, it could just be because of the redacted names. So it could very well be that Trump indeed has done something wrong, and we just don't know yet because, again, of the redacted names that shouldn't be redacted. But for now, there's just no evidence that Trump did anything wrong. At absolute worst, I found people making accusations like this one right here, where just some random guy is accusing Epstein's brother of knowing that Trump slept with an underage girl on his island and attempting to blackmail him for $10K for this alleged knowledge. This is, in my opinion, the most incriminating thing you can find. And the problem is, even this is just not conclusive enough to put Orange Man away. It's just an accusation and attempted blackmail. You don't actually know for sure if it's true. In fact, a very good possibility is that this is just someone who suspects that it is true and is making the accusation in an attempt at phishing, which basically means it doesn't really prove anything at all. But overall, the main important takeaway here is that it's not just so much Trump, it's important to understand that the Epstein files are just a massive document dump. The phrase X person appears in the Epstein files in general is just a disingenuous phrase unless it comes with some context. Due to the fact that Epstein was receiving email forwards in regards to the news, well, I mean, that alone means that just about every single prominent person is going to appear in the Epstein files. And so thus their appearance alone proves absolutely nothing. And if we whip this back to the mainstream media narrative, where a lot of them are just completely focused on Donald Trump, it really just seems to be an attempted propaganda narrative where they're just going to pretend like they have evidence that they don't actually have. And so we're seeing the usual outlets that are known for having a pretty heavy Democrat Party bias in their favor. They're all just kind of focusing on Trump, Trump, Trump in order to try and make people associate Epstein files with Trump. Even though, one, we don't actually have any evidence yet that Trump did anything wrong, and two, more importantly, there's way more to the Epstein files than Trump, which almost makes me suspect that this narrative is actually just intentional as a distraction, because a lot of corporate media executives also appear in the Epstein files. And so they're just using a reporting bias strategy on Donald Trump to kind of deflect from the fact that they're equally guilty for the same reasons that they're using against Trump. As for how guilty they are, unfortunately, only time will tell, because again, a lot of those names are redacted, and they shouldn't be, and people have every right to be outraged about that. But the key thing to remember here is that the Epstein files are a much more all-encompassing net than it first appears to be. It includes a massive amount of things that you would just normally expect to find in any kind of email list. And so if context isn't included along that accusation against someone, it's probably nonsense. Anyways, lastly, I'd like to weigh in on the ephebophilia question. Because another take that's just kind of making the rounds on the internet is people noticing that Epstein wasn't actually targeting those you would consider children, but rather he was targeting those who you would consider underage teenage girls. And so thus there's a narrative going around saying, okay, maybe Epstein wasn't actually that bad, reigniting the whole, okay, where should the age of consent be discussion. And the thing I'd like to point out here, the only reason I even mention it, which is that there's a big part of this discussion that most people just kind of gloss over, which is the problem really is just the fact that we have a really hard, thick line between, okay, that's perfectly fine, and that's completely evil to the point where this guy needs to be yeeted into the sun, leading to some, oh, she was only 17 years old and one day before her 18th birthday, you sick freak. And then, of course, one day after her birthday is perfectly perfectly fine. And yes, there's a valid point there. However, the problem is it's still kind of wrong. And so what I've never really understood is why don't people just move it to being a misdemeanor? Because that way, from a legality standpoint, we can at least say that, okay, it's still bad, but maybe it's not as bad. Because I think everybody does kind of know the problem behind this. You don't just wake up one day and you're just suddenly mature enough to be able to consent. That's something that just kind of slowly builds up over time. And yet our laws currently don't really match how human psychology works. And there's some truth to it. Someone at the age of 18 is likely more responsible than they were at the age of 16. And of course, their level of responsibility at 16 is going to be higher than what they had at the age of 14. And at 14, they're going to have a better sense of responsibility than what they had at 12, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. This fact is pretty much overwhelmingly supported by mountains of evidence to the point where you almost don't even need to cite that evidence because every rational person just sort of knows this. If you are a human being and you're an adult, then you grew up, and if you remember being a child and growing up from that to become a teenager and growing up from that to become an adult, then you know that you slowly gained a sense of responsibility as the years went by. And yet our current laws do not match this reality. Instead, from a legal perspective in the West, we mostly treat people as if they are functionally incognizant, possessing zero agency until their 18th birthday, when people just supposedly magically gain a conscious sense of awareness of our actions and their consequences. And that's obviously just not how it works. So I think perhaps a good idea that can be thrown into discussion would be considering making these kinds of lewd acts around a certain teenage age range, like 15 to 17, a misdemeanor instead. That way, at least from the legal sense of the discussion, people could more easily say that it should still be a crime without having that ridiculous, weird, thick line in the sand. This would not only better match our understanding of human development and psychology, but most importantly, it would allow us to say, okay, it's not that bad, but it's still bad. Because let's be honest, a 50-year-old man going after a 16-year-old girl is pretty freaking disgusting. But it's just not as downright evil and yeet him into the sun as that same man going after a freaking 9-year-old. But in terms of Epstein himself, and this just may be my opinion, I don't really think it absolves him of that much. Because you have to remember, he was also pimping them out to other elites. Even if they weren't underage, you could still argue that the way these girls were being treated was degenerate and immoral. So even in the best case scenario for Epstein, where you can't tack an objective crime on him, there would still at the very least be very good reasons to not want to associate with him. Because there's one thing you have to remember about the Epstein Files, and one thing that has been proven and one take that is true, which is that the Epstein Files really does just kind of confirm the fact that our ruling elites are kind of terrible. If you look at, say, the Epstein archives, you'll notice that Epstein has some pretty deep ties to various state and financial elites, ranging from the United States to the European Union to, of course, Israel. There's a particularly good article I'll leave you with from Mises Wire. Everyone agrees our elites are terrible, so why are we stuck with them? The problem with elites is that in just about every single society, we still have this idea that we need a non-productive class, that there just isn't a better way. And the problem with that is that it just kind of guarantees the existence of a self-interested elite rather than an elite class that is actually being held accountable by requiring voluntary association. The solution is that you should have the choice to not have to buy what these elites are selling. And until we have that choice, then the elite class is going to inevitably be populated by mostly these kind of parasites, who are guaranteed to continue to participate in horrible things like the Epstein case. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, becoming a member of the channel, or by just buying some merch. Thanks again for watching. That is all for now. Till next time.